Hello, I'm Dan, and I'm doing the reading tonight from Matthew 12, 46 through 50. While Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mothers and brothers stood outside, wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you." He replied to him, "Who is my mother? And who are my brothers?" Pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother."
Good evening. My name is Madeline Luzinski, and if you were here last week, my friend Ryan Frack and I were up here, and we were interviewed as part of the beginning of this series. And my role at the children's home is I serve as the director of Pastoral Care. And so what that means is as we bring children into our care as they're removed from their homes or whatever situations that they're coming from, my charge is to make sure that we're caring for them spiritually. And so whatever that looks like for them, we take a moment to get to know each of them, to know their spiritual history, and to learn how we best can serve them while they're with us. And that is my charge at the children's home. And so it looks a lot like week-to-week programming of Sunday morning services and youth group and fun games and worship arts like dance and music and acting and a lot of fun. But I really take seriously the charge to show these children the love of God and to show them acceptance and this unconditional love that they really honestly deserve and haven't always experienced. And so as we gather today, I had a really awesome opportunity to hang out with Occupy Trilogy this week, and that was a really cool opportunity to get to know some of you all and to get to know what kinds of things you all are thinking as you're sitting out here this evening and listening to the things that I might be saying. So when I think of orphans, I admit that just because of the term, my mind goes straight to developing countries. And maybe that's because I worked for 2 months with an NGO in Kenya, and we worked specifically with orphans who had lost their parents to HIV and AIDS. And so we had these terms of partial orphan or total orphan, meaning one of your parents had passed away, you're a partial orphan. If you had both of your parents pass away, you're a total orphan. And there are many total orphans who were caring for their siblings if they had siblings. So there would be a 14-year-old that would now become the head of the household. And so my job at that particular NGO was to go around and to do house visits with these young people and to make sure that they had the resources they needed to survive, but be able to continue in their education, to have hope for a future. And so sometimes I know that when we hear the word orphan, we kind of have the Orphan Annie picture of someone who's impoverished, who doesn't have a lot, who is completely, on their own. And we talked a little bit at Occupy about the superheroes that we think of that have the orphan backstory, or how, for whatever reason, every Disney movie ever has, every main character only has at least one parent. I don't know why, but because we kind of valorize this idea that we can pick up our bootstraps and like the most amazing stories come from people who have come from nothing. And so we want to give them that kind of depravity in order to then see the amazing places that they can come from. So when I think of orphan, a lot of times my mind goes there, but that's not, like you all have pointed out, exactly who orphans are. And there's a very diverse concept of what an orphan is. And so over time, Christians specifically have sought to take care of orphans. As Ben pointed out, like there is this Old Testament call to care for the orphan and the widow, and orphans and widows have existed since communities and people groups have existed. There's always been kids without homes or kids without families. And so some of our attempts to care for them started way back in like the book of Acts, when they appointed 7 disciples to go around and care for the widows and make sure that they were fed. And then later on in like the 4th century, we had St. Basil, who started actually what we know now as social work and created community supports for people who were vulnerable and making sure that they had things like food and clothing and the things that they needed. And then we've created these systems and orphanages, right? And that's how the children's home began, as it was an orphanage in 1908. And we still have orphanages all around the world. There are many of them that we still have that image of the developing country where there are the orphanages full of kids that are still in dire straits. But here in the United States, we have the foster care system. And it's a system that is definitely still flawed. But when we think about many other places in the world, it is better than it could be. And so I want to share with you some statistics of our foster care system here in the state of Florida. And we use this term in out-of-home care for kids. So that's a child who is not living with their birth parents. And you'll see that in Florida, as of this year, February 1st, there were 24,198 children who are in out-of-home care right now in the state of Florida, just Florida. And 700 of those are in Volusia County. And when we think about that 24,198, and I use the whole number because every single child matters, most of them end up being cared for by family members. So 43% of that 24,000 end up being housed by another family member, whether it's an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a grandparent. But a lot of times what you'll find, particularly when kids end up in the care of grandparents, grandparents age. And so they end up coming back into the system in one way or another. But if 43% are living with their families in some other setting, then 30%, which is about 7,000, are placed into foster care. And then if we look at what I do, 9%, or 2,000, are in group care like the children's home. And so there's a lot of different ways that we approach this issue of needing essential hospitality for a child. And the job of case managers is to be able to look at the needs of the child and see which type of placement is really the best suitable for them. And just to dispel any presuppositions, because I know that I have preconceived notions of things, and as we've mentioned earlier, that orphans are diverse, 60% of the youth in care in Florida right now are white, and 30% are black. And there was a study that was done in 2016 where they took a cohort of kids that were born in 2005, and they followed them until 2015. And 1 in 5 children in the state of Florida will have been reported to the child welfare system in their first 5 years of life. So reported. That doesn't mean that they're actually removed from their home, but there is some report made about their well-being to the state of Florida. 1 in 5 kids. And that's a staggering statistic to think about. And so there's a real need here, especially in Florida. And I want you all to know that in the state of Florida, you are mandatory reporters. Every single person. It's not just healthcare professionals. It's not just teachers. If you suspect that a child is being mistreated, it is your responsibility to call the abuse hotline. And I highly recommend Googling that and figuring out how to do that and who to call and what information that you need, because you could save a child's life in doing that. And so while some of the youth in our system are in the system for that traditional reason of they don't have parents because parents have passed away, so many of our kids have come into care for a variety of different reasons. And so I want to share with you just a couple of the different scenarios of some of our youth and why they are in our care. One of them is a young person who has been in the foster care system in and out for about 8 years. And that's something that I hadn't thought much about until I came into my role at the children's home, is how often I would see kids come back. And it's one of those very bittersweet things, because you learn to grow and love a child and you get excited to see them again, but then you realize why you're seeing them again, and that's not something that you're very happy about. And so one of the people in our care has been in and out of our home for about 8 years because their mother's been addicted to drugs. And as we know, addiction is a long, ongoing healing process. And so the ebb and flow of this young person's stay with the children's home has been dependent on their mother's relapses. But in the past year, their mother has been clean for a full year, which is amazing. And they have been able to go and visit their mom multiple times a week, and just now are waiting for the opportunity to be reunited and be reunified once their mom secures housing in the next couple of months. And so that is a positive, and we're really excited and have seen a really big change in that family. Another situation was a young woman who was sexually abused as a child and then was taken from her home and then was placed in foster care. And then, for whatever reason, the foster family had a hard time dealing with her behaviors. And so they sent her to the children's home because she needed extra therapy. But during the time that she was at the children's home, they decided to adopt her brother, who was also staying with them, but not her. And so while she was with us, they adopted her brother, but didn't adopt her. And so there was that separation in a way that was allowed by the system because we need kids to have homes, right? But in the end, the positive was that she was able to be adopted by her grandparents. And so she still has a relationship with her brother, but her brothers and her relationship is obviously very limited based on when the foster now adopted mom allows them to see each other. The last one that I'll share with you was a youth who was placed with their grandparents, and this is what I shared before, but several years later after being placed with their grandparents are no longer at a place where they can take care of them, and so they come into the care. A lot of times we do see that when grandparents pass away, kids come in and they're grieving the loss of their grandparent and grieving the loss of that connection with their family, and so they come into our care. So there are a lot of different ways that kids come to us. 90% of them are through some form of grief. But we can see, even though they're not the stereotypical idea of an orphan who's just lost their parents and has nowhere else to go, that there are a lot of similarities between kids in out-of-home care today and in the United States as there are in those kind of traditional pictures of kids who are running in the streets or orphaned from years gone by, because they're still vulnerable. They're still less likely to make it, and they're still very susceptible to whatever type of hospitality the state or their guardian is willing to offer them. And so that's where we have to step in. Because the practical problem is that they don't have homes, right? And we can say homes as in, like, they don't have a building, and they don't have consistent food, and they don't have someone to take them to school every day. And that's one aspect of it, and that's a very important aspect of it. But there's something more to this definition of a home, right? It's a place of belonging. It's people who care about you and who want you there. And that's something that they're all lacking. And so the more that I've reflected on this problem that we're seeking to solve and we're talking about today, is the more I've recognized it as a theological problem. There's a cultural view and a worldview problem that's associated with the idea of kids being orphaned. And so we read the passage from Matthew 12. And if you were here last week, that was our benediction, but I thought it was great to take the benediction as we walked out and pick it up and let it be the passage that we read again today. Because in it, Jesus says this thing where he's like, whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother or my mother or my sister. And he drops the bomb, and when you're looking at the text, it's the classic Jesus thing where he doesn't really give a reason before or afterwards. It's like someone just interrupts what he's saying, and he just throws this thing out, and then we're left to kind of figure out what you meant by it, Jesus. Great. But what he does is he sets up a new way of thinking about family. He expands this idea of family. He exposes our narrow view of what it means to be joined with other people. Because really, family and this idea of loving our neighbor is not about blood, it's about joining. And it would be really irresponsible to take that teaching and say, okay, Jesus expands our idea of family. Jesus says that our idea of family is narrow, so therefore Jesus is anti-family. That's not what I'm trying to say. Jesus isn't trying to completely dismantle the idea of a nuclear family, because Jesus clearly cares about relationships with people. He has people that he's close to. He cares and hears the pleas of parents when their children are in need of healing. And even from the cross, Jesus cares for his own mother and asks a disciple to care for her. So he's not trying to dismantle. But I had a professor in seminary who blew my mind one day and said that one of our biggest problems in our culture is that we have an idolatry of the family, and more beyond that, we have an idolatry of the couple, like that we can't see individual people as valuable in and of themselves. They always have to be attached to someone else. That's where that like really unhealthy relationship thing about like you complete me comes from, is like you're complete all on your own. You don't need someone else, right? And so we idolize this idea of being together in marriage or being together in this family. But I'm not going to turn around and tell my kids, like, you're just idolizing family, right? Like, that's clearly not the response to this situation. But what is in that is that we idolize this perfect image of family of two parents and their 2.35 children, and that's the way that family is supposed to look, right? But Jesus points out here that no, family is expanded. Anyone who follows after. And so we could get into this whole theological thing about the Trinity, right? Where Jesus, in baptism and in our decision to follow God, invites us into this Trinitarian relationship that exists between Father, Son, Spirit, and what we're welcomed into the divine dance that's already happening, this familial relationship, that we are part of that. And so that's how we are all orphans. At one point, we were all separate from God and outside of God's family in some way, shape, or form, and then we're joined in and we're adopted. Paul uses that actual language, that we have this spirit of adoption, that we are welcomed in the family of God. We are joined, and it's not about blood, it's about joining. And so when we get to this conversation of essential hospitality, and that's where this is going next week, Ryan's going to come in and talk to us about what essential hospitality looks like and what that can look like at the children's home. But when we think about it for ourselves, we have to realize that essential hospitality is essential for the orphan because it goes beyond loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor is different than joining your neighbor. It's a different level of intimacy. Welcoming someone into your family is very different than loving them and bringing them a cup of sugar next door. And so that's a different call, the call to join. And that's what we're called to do with these kids, is to join with them. And a silly example of how we can do that and how we can expand our view of family and how we can expand on and live into this type of family and kingdom and tribe and community that Jesus is preaching to, albeit in an offhanded way, is that we can just be simply aware. One, we can use better language, which if anybody knows things about language and proper language, this community does. I mean, it's part of your community statement. But when you speak to youth, or anyone really, don't assume they have a mom and a dad. It's a very simple way of expanding our idea of family. I can't tell you how many times I've cringed when we take our youth off campus and we take them to a well-meaning human being who says, "Oh, aren't you so excited to show this to your mom or dad?" Or, "Oh, aren't you going to tell your mom or dad about how this happens?" And stop saying mom and dad. Because one, they might have two moms and two dads, and two, the adult that's taking care of them might not be called mom or dad, and so can we at least expand the idea that there are other humans taking care of little humans, and that's how we live together. And so we have to expand our language, and then we have to expand our actions and how we live into that. How can we be a home to someone who needs it? That's the question. And so some of that means that you provide a physical home, because that is important. Food, home, shelter, security, stability, that's part of survival, and we need that. And our kids need that. And so maybe if you're thinking about this and you're thinking about how to provide essential hospitality, that's your call, is to provide a literal home for a child. And so today we do have some representatives from our foster care department here. And so I hope that you'll go and you'll talk to them afterwards, just even to learn a little bit more about foster care in Florida and the process of how to even welcome a child into your home, even for a little while. But how can we, without a building, with our bodies and our language and our presence, be a safe place for people who are desperate for that safe place? How are we going to do that? That's my charge for you this evening.
Clarence, can you throw that, robot voice, can you throw that text up again? I want to read this again and a little slowly, and just let us kind of hear it. While Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside, wanting to speak to him. Side note, how many of you guys were under the impression Jesus was an only child? I was for a long time, probably till last November. Apparently he has brothers. Someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you." He replied to him, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" Pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." I think what we've said last week and this week is part of what Jesus understands as the will of his Father in heaven. Part of the tradition he inherits is to care for orphans. So there's this interesting sort of cyclical logic here, where by doing the will of God and caring for orphans, people are then mother and brother and sister, and sort of with what Madeline is saying, that by doing the work of caring for orphans, you're actually creating an environment in which you are mother and brother and sister. There's this theological distinction that was made by the liberation movement, in which the phrase kingdom of God, a phrase which communicates maleness and power, because kings are male and kings have power, is replaced with the phrase kindom, K-I-N-D-O-M, the kingdom in which all are equals. Brothers and sisters, everyone is kin. Also understood, everyone is family. And so once again, the bread and the wine represent a banquet that's open to all. The body and the blood of Christ, which invite us to an open table. And the way of Christ. Not beliefs about, but as Madeline pointed out, what do we do with our bodies? What do we do with our words? What do we do with our presence? What do we do with the space around us and our energy? The way of Christ, which makes us siblings in the kingdom of God. It's the table of this kingdom that is open to us tonight, is always open not only to us, but to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.